Hello, we are going to read the poem called A Selfish Giant, written by Oscar Wilde. It was published in 1888 by Oscar Wilde and is considered to be a timeless classic. This is a fairy tale for children, which is usually read at night. The author had 2 children. It is said that it was for his children that Wilde began to compose the first fairy tales. No wonder he declared that it is the duty of every father to compose fairy tales for his children, although the child's mind always remains a great mystery.
It is believed that one of the sources of inspiration for this fairy tale was the writer's previous tour of the USA. It was in the Countryville Ghost that Wilde confronted American pragmatism, deaf to everything wonderful, with the old-fashioned English romantic tradition. No one benefits from these collisions. Both the Americans and the ghost of Sir Simon are comical.
In fact, the writer's interest in the genre arose much earlier by origin. Wilde was another Irish man who glorified English literature, and thanks to his mother, he absorbed numerous Celtic myths and the genre from childhood. It was the fairy tale genre that prompted Oscar to turn to prose for the first time.
Wilde's real fame among the general public was brought by the 1888 collection, The Happy Prince and Other Tales. Critics praised the tales very highly, and everyone noted elegant and simple style at the same time. In 1891, the second fairy tale collection of the writer, The Pomegranate House, was published, and he was met with less flattering responses. Critics felt that fairy tales were overloaded with details and too complex for children's perception.
The giant loved this boy more than anyone else. He yearned for his friend and often remembered him. He spent many years in this anticipation. All these years he was invariably kind, affectionate and patient with children. He didn't return to his egoism. Moreover, he was able to fall in love with children. The most beautiful flowers are children, and stopped hating winter because he knew that at this time spring only dormant and the flowers were resting.
Wilde's tales are loved by readers all over the world. They are interesting to people of all ages. These touching, sad, funny stories make you think about such eternal concepts as good and evil, love and friendship, devotion and compassion. Before you is the best of the writer's creative heritage. Wilde's tales glorify the beauty of good deeds, sympathy for the offended humanity.
Many readers, and especially children, fell in love with a beautiful story about changing yourself for the better. Even a giant who loves only himself becomes someone completely different. From selfish and squeezed, he becomes someone who can love and appreciate. Also, this poem has a small hint about pixies and Beagle. Thank you for the attention.
Every afternoon, as they were coming from school, the children used to go and play in the giant's garden. It was a large, lovely garden with soft green grass. Here and there over the grass stood beautiful flowers like stars, and there were 12 peach trees that in the springtime broke out into delicate blossoms of pink and pearl, and in the autumn bore rich fruit. The birds sat on the trees and sang so sweetly that the children used to stop their games in order to listen to them. "How happy we are here!" they cried to each other. One day the giant came back. He'd been to visit his friend, the Cornish ogre, and had stayed with him for 7 years. After the 7 years were over, he had said all that he had to say, for his conversation was limited, and he determined to return to his own castle. When he arrived, he saw the children playing in the garden. "What are you doing here?" he cried in a very gruff voice, and the children ran away. "My own garden is my own garden," said the giant, Anyone can understand that, and I will allow nobody to play in it but myself." So he built a high wall all around it and put up a notice board. "Trespassers will be prosecuted." He was a very selfish giant.
The poor children had nowhere to play. They tried to play on the road, but the road was very dusty and full of hard stone, and they didn't like it. They used to wander around the high wall when the lessons were over and talk about the beautiful garden inside. "How happy we were there," they said to each other. Then the spring came, and all over the country there were little blossoms and little birds. Only in the garden of Selfish Giant it was still winter. The bird did not care to sing in it, and there were no children, and the tree forgot to blossom. Once a beautiful flower put its head out from the grass, but when it saw the notice board it was so sorry for children that it slipped back into the ground again and went off to sleep. The only people who were pleased were the snow and the frost. "Spring has forgotten the garden," they cried, "so we'll live here for a year around." The snow covered up the grass with her great white cloak, and the frost painted all the trees silver. They invited the North Wind to stay with them, and he came. He was wrapped in fur, and rode all day about the garden, and blew the chimney pots down. "It's the life of sport," he said. "We must ask the hail on a visit."
So the hail came. Every day for 3 hours he rattled on the roof of the castle till he broke most of the slates, and then he ran round and round the garden as fast as he could go. He was dressed in grey, and his breath was like ice. "I cannot understand why the spring is so late in coming," said the Selfish Giant, as he sat at the window and looked out at his cold white garden. "I hope there will be a change in the weather." But the spring never came, nor the summer. The autumn gave golden fruit to every garden, but to the giant's garden she gave none. "He is too selfish," she said. So it was always winter there, and the north wind and the hail and the frost and the snow danced about through the trees. One morning the giant was lying awake in bed when he heard some lovely music. It sounded so sweet to his ears that he thought it must be the king's musicians passing by.
It was really only a little linnet singing outside his window. But it was so long since he had heard a bird sing in his garden that it seemed to him to be the most beautiful music in the world. Then the hail stopped dancing over his head, and the north wind ceased roaring, and the delicious perfume came to him through the open casement. "I believe the spring has come at last," said the giant, and he jumped out of bed and looked out. What did he see? He saw a most wonderful sight. Through a little hole in the wall the children had crept in, and they were sitting in the branches of the trees. In every tree that he could see there was a little child. And the trees were so glad to have the children back again that they had covered themselves with blossoms, and were waving their arms gently above the children's heads. The birds were flying about and twittering with delight, and the flowers were looking up through the green grass and laughing. It was a lovely scene. Only in one corner it was still winter.
It was the farthest corner of the garden, and in it was standing a little boy. He was so small that he couldn't reach up to the branch of the tree, and he was wandering all around it, crying bitterly. The poor tree was still quite covered with frost and snow, and the north wind was blowing and roaring about it. "Climb up, little boy," said the tree, and it bent its branch down as low as it could be, but the boy was too tiny, and the giant's heart melted as he looked out. How selfish I have been, he said. No, I know why the spring wouldn't come here. I'll put that poor little boy on the top of the tree, and then I will knock down the wall, and my garden shall be the children's playground forever and ever. He was really very sorry for what he had done. So he crept downstairs and opened the front door quite softly, and went out into the garden. But when the children saw him, they were so frightened that they all ran away, and the garden became winter again. Only the little boy didn't run, for his eyes were so full of tears that he didn't see the giant coming.
Every afternoon, when school was over, the children came and played with the giant. But the little boy, whom the giant loved, was never seen again. The giant was very kind to all the children, yet he longed for his first little friend and often spoke of him. How I would like to see him, he used to say. Years went over, and the giant grew very old and feeble. He could not play about anymore, so he sat in a huge armchair and watched the children at the games and admired his garden. I have many beautiful flowers, he said, but the children are the most beautiful flowers of all. One winter morning, he looked out of his window as he was dressing. He didn't hate the winter now, for he knew that it was merely the spring, asleep, and that the flowers were resting. Suddenly, he rubbed his eyes in wonder and looked and looked. It certainly was a marvelous sight. In the farthest corner of the garden was a tree, quite covered with lovely white blossoms. Its branches were all golden, and silver fruit hung down from them, and underneath it stood the little boy he had loved. Downstairs ran the giant in a great joy, and out into the garden. He hastened across the grass and came near to the child.
And when he came quite close, his face grew red with anger, and he said, "Who had dared to wound thee?" For on the palms of the child's hands were the prints of 2 nails, and the prints of 2 nails were on the little feet. "Who had dared to wound thee?" cried the giant. "Tell me, that I may take my big sword and slay him." "Nay," answered the child, "but these are wounds of love." "Who art thou?" said the giant, and stretched out feeling him, and he knelt before the little child. And the child smiled on the giant, and said to him, "You let me play once in your garden, today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise." And when the children ran it that afternoon, they found the giant lying dead under the all covered with white blossoms.